Good morning. Let me thank the members who are here. We may get one or two more. Let me thank the members for coming. I realize this is a Friday and it's a recess day, but these are a couple of very important initiatives, one of which we'll hopefully take a vote on very quickly. The other we'll just have a hearing on. I think it's more of a learning session. We're going to have a PowerPoint presentation on the anti-gang bill presented by the DeKalb District Attorney's Office on behalf of the DA's Association. And it's I've been working on that with the association for several months now, and it's been a real eye-opener for me. And I like to think I'm fairly informed about such things, but it really has been an education for me, and a lot of things that I certainly was not aware of before in terms of that kind of activity and its relationship to the overall drug trafficking problem. And we won't get into that right now, but I'd encourage members, if you can, after we take up 1016, if you can stay for that, for part or all of that presentation, whatever conversation we have after that, I certainly would encourage you to do it. I think you'll get a lot out of it. With that, let me direct your attention to House Bill. Let's take up House Bill 1016. This comes to us from the at the request, really, of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, and has to do with prosecution of identity theft. Right now, the way the code is written, prosecutors, and they can speak for themselves in case I misstate anything. Right now, they have the ability to pursue those individuals who would perpetrate identity theft on individuals, such as any one of us, but are not able to go ahead and pursue prosecution of those who would perpetrate identity theft on a business, a small business, corporation, etc. Given the fact that the wording of the statute uses individual, a corporation, a business, for legal purposes is within the definition of a person. A business, a corporation is a person, whereas an individual, using the word individual, does not allow them to go ahead and capture identity theft as it relates to a business. So what House Bill 1016 does is simply, where applicable, change the word individual to a person in order for them to be able to capture that kind of crime as when it's perpetrated on a business. And of course, as we know full well, small business is the anchor of our economy, not just in our communities, not just in our state, but in our nation. Anything that we can do to protect them from what I believe and what I think I have learned to be a rampant problem, and only an increasing problem as technology refinements occur every day. And unfortunately, those technology refinements and advances are not just used by those of us in our communities for good purposes, but also for those who would seek to rip off our neighbors, frankly. So, with that, I mean, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I think it's I hope it's fairly straightforward. Mr. Everson.
At the proper time, I have a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin.
At the proper time, I'll have a second.
Thank you.
Are you accepting thirds?
Hey, listen, I'll take whatever I can get. I have a request for a motion in light of the time. Is there any member of the audience who would object to me going ahead and taking that motion right now? I know the Chamber of Commerce is here in support of the DA's Association. Seeing no flailing arms, I'll go Mr. Everson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I move due pass on House Bill 1016.
Thank you. Motion by Mr. Everson of due pass, second by Mr. Franklin. Thank you very much, Mr. Levitas. Any amendments? Any further discussion? On the gentleman's motion, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries. Thank you, members of the committee. Let me ask on House Bill 1015 if I know that District Attorney from DeKalb County, Gwendolyn Keys Fleming, is here along with her team from her office. Feel free to, I know you all have a PowerPoint presentation. Members of the committee, I think it'd just be a good idea if we went ahead and went into their PowerPoint presentation as sort of to give us a general picture of what the gang picture looks like, for lack of a better term, what it's looking like on the investigation end, what it's looking like on the prosecution end. I think it's also, and I assume in the presentation, we'll get a picture of what what gang activity looks like in 2010. I think we have a predisposed notion from, and we're no different than the people we represent in our communities, of what we see on television, whether in local news, national news, or even in entertainment television. And that may be a different picture than what these folks are dealing with every day. So, Ms. Fleming, let me ask you and or your team, however you want to work that, to come up, and we'll certainly happy to take any statement that you have, and then I assume we'll just go into the PowerPoint from there. Okay, great.
Thank you. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I would like my Deputy Chief, Gang Prosecutor Mike Carlson, to come up. I have an apprentice with my office who's been working with us, Morgan Perkins. She's actually a licensed lawyer out of New York, but is here helping us as a result of the economy and some other things. She'll be planning to take the bar, I believe, in February. And then we are also blessed to have Mr. John Floyd, who is a partner at Bondurant, Mixon, and Elmore. He is a nationally renowned expert in RICO violations. He not only wrote the book comparing all of the federal RICO laws with the various state laws, but he's also prosecuted a few. As you may know, he prosecuted the case of Sidney Dorsey in DeKalb County, and has also handled a lot of civil work relating to RICO. And we brought him up because the gang laws are, in effect, a narrower version of the RICO laws as it relates specifically to gang activity. And so he's the man that knows all about the constitutionality issues of RICO, and we'll go into some of the differences and why our gang statute is even tighter than the RICO laws that we have, and therefore should survive have survived any constitutional challenges and should survive any in the future. If we can, we'll go ahead and get started. And again, my name is Gwen Keys Fleming. It's my pleasure to serve as the District Attorney in DeKalb County. I think I've met some of you throughout the last 5 years in this position, and for those that I haven't, good morning. I look forward to talking with you more about this a little bit later.
Mr. Chairman, I think we may need to, or maybe about the next meeting.
Let me make sure I do this right. Rob Lafayette had come over here to tell me exactly what to do, and of course it didn't sink in. So.
Do all of you have a handout or a packet from us?
Those are in the files, yeah.
Okay, good.
Hold on, go.
What you'll see is not only the gang brochure from our office, which is what we hand out to the community to educate them about what gangs are and what they aren't, and also how to recognize it if you see it in your community, or God forbid somebody in your household comes home with these items, what you can do to try to talk to your children about joining gangs. But also it kind of summarizes the main points of the PowerPoint presentation in case you want to take them with you later.
Let me, let's give Rob a second here to... He may be the only one in this room actually knows how to do this, so...
We're tall enough to reach.
And therefore it makes him the most valuable player. That's right. Now, do we need to do the command from the board here in order to... That was Rob Lafayette, committee aide to the Judiciary Non-Civil Committee, with the play of the day. Ms. Fleming.
Morgan or somebody can do it. This morning, what we'll be looking at is the nature of the gang problem, the 2006 legislative changes, and that's really was a fantastic move in the right direction towards being able to make our communities safer and address the issues of gangs. And then also, why after that great legislation do we think improvements can be made to enable us to do our jobs even better? So we'll be able to cover those three things.
Let me ask you to move the microphone just a little, if you could prop it up. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Does that work better?
Perfect.
Can everybody?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Just gang problem in generally. One of the things that you'll see is that the number, there's an alarming increase not only in the number of gangs, the number of gang members, the types of communities that gang victimize, I think there's a misconception that gangs only exist in metro areas. And what the national stats are showing us, and we'll go into it a little bit more, as well as the Georgia stats are showing, is that gangs are expanding into the suburban and rural communities, because they look at that as kind of unfettered ground, new territory, if you will. And so they're trying to be the ones to expand and go out and take over these territories, actually. And so the gang problem generally, based on the FBI stats, there's over 1 million gang members nationwide, which is up from 200,000 in 2005. And so think about that. In a 5-year term, or 4-year span of time, the FBI, and this is a conservative estimate, has gone up 5-fold. And all of their stats show that gang violence is responsible for 80% of the crime in most communities. Here in Georgia, we have just under 10,000 gangs, 9,871 gangs, with more than 172,000 gang members. In some cases, that's the amount of a county, or the population of a county, or certainly a city here in the state of Georgia. And so their numbers are growing as well. What we have come to realize is that gang members don't only attack each other. Generally what happens as there is a turf battle, which usually starts by tagging in one area by a particular gang. The opposing gang comes in, does the tagging over it as if to say, this is not your turf, we're taking over. And then that escalates into violence where you can have gang wars, gang shootouts, drive-by shootings, those types of things. But it's not just the gang members that are injured or killed in those situations. Very often it's the innocent bystanders, our children, our family members. And so that's another reason why we are spending so much time on this, because it's not just something that'll be contained between gang members in a limited area. It affects all of us. And I think if you think about the things that you've seen as you drive home on billboards or on the side of bridges or on the side of buildings, it's not just creativity. We have the intel to explain what it means, what they're trying to say through that. And I think we've got some slides of some of that graffiti and can kind of explain that. To show you that compared to the country, and we blew up the area relating to the southeast, law enforcement is reporting that at least 50%, and from 2004 to 2008, you can see the purple, it's gone up, that 68% of law enforcement agencies in the state or in the southeast are reporting an increase of gang violence. And that's compared with 49% 4 years ago or 5 years ago. And if you look and see the purple compared to the southeast and California, where, and I don't know if you can see from here, the California number I believe is 74%. We're at 68%. So we're not far behind California in terms of the reports of gang violence and those types of things from our law enforcement agencies. The connection between gangs and drugs. Again, a lot of these turf battles occur because they're expanding drug territory, and so for them it's a business, and they want to either encroach upon the other gang's business or protect their business from encroachment from others. And so you see a lot of gang violence centered around trying to protect their drug trade. And again, it's the bystanders that get caught up in this violence. Cocaine, this shows you the types of drugs that our gangs are fighting over, whether it's powdered cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, MDMA, or other pharmaceutical drugs, at least in the last several years. And again, 2008 is the purple bar. These are reports, gang threat assessment reports. Most jurisdictions are above 50% in powdered cocaine, crack cocaine, and marijuana. For 2008, or at least for the last 3 years, if you go back to 2005. And again, we're seeing it's a very serious problem as these gangs try to protect their product, if you will. Cocaine is usually, here in Georgia at least, cocaine is the #1 drug that is used by gangs as retail distributors. And I mean, it may be weird to think of it in those terms, but that's the closest thing that we can come to. And as they protect their turf in that regard, they're engaging in these violent crimes, whether it's assault, homicide, just to protect their turf. As I said before, no place in Georgia is immune. This is not just a metro area problem. Whether it's the Folks Gang and the Piru Gang in Baldwin County, whether it's the Aryan Nation or Black Gangsters Disciples in Lamar County, Bloods, Crips, and Latin Kings in Whitfield County, and we've got the individual, if you're interested in your particular county, we do have a list of the types of gangs that law enforcement has intelligence on in that particular county or community. That was provided to us by the Georgia Gang Investigators Association. And again, it's a conservative number because it is only reported by the only way they're getting the information is from the officers that actually go and take their class. So a lot of jurisdictions that can't afford to send an officer or haven't been able to send one for whatever reason, they may be experiencing gangs too. It's just that we don't have a uniform way of collecting that information at this point. All of this is what I believe prompted the legislature in 2006 to create the bill that we currently have. And one of the great things in the purpose section of the bill is that the General Assembly recognized that we are in a state of crisis with our gang. This is the language right out of the bill that was passed 4 years ago. And they do recognize that in light of all of this, the members that threaten, terrorize, and commit a multitude of crimes, that all of this is presenting a clear and present danger to public order and safety. And I'll get into it a little bit more. The importance of this statute is it only relates to criminal conduct, and it does not violate the right to just associate with people, to dress like whoever you want, hang out with whoever you want. We only get to be able to use the Gang Act when someone actually commits a crime. And then it becomes an add-on to the underlying charge. So we're not Georgia is unique in that we don't prosecute people simply for being gang members. It's not just who you know and who you associate with. You only get prosecuted when whoever you associate with, if you are associated in fact, as you'll see in a minute, you actually go out and commit a crime. One of the few crimes that's listed in the gang statute. So, again, in 2006, or prior to 2006, it was very difficult for prosecutors to be able to get a handle on or address the gang violence for a number of reasons. There were a lot of hurdles. You may be aware of the, go to the next one. It was upgraded in several ways, provided very specific definitions. Again, we're trying to tailor it to criminal conduct, and so they spent a lot of time in the statute making sure that they defined what a criminal street gang was and what criminal gang activity, not just gang activity, but criminal gang activity. There were also several charging provisions that made it easier for prosecutors. One of the big things was that they removed pattern of, that we had to show 3 acts or 3 predicate acts in order to establish any kind of gang violation, and remove the in furtherance of. A lot of the criminal components were clarified. And then there were some procedural rules. One of the things that's important to understand about the gang bill is that it's an additional burden for prosecutors to prove. Not only do we normally have to prove this defendant committed this crime, kind of a very linear, but the Gang Act adds a third element that we have to prove, that it was that defendant is related to a gang, and through that gang they committed, or in association with that gang, they committed this particular offense. And so because of that higher burden for prosecutors, they allowed us to be able to bring in evidence about gang-related activities. But again, the offense was better tailored to only apply to certain crimes. It's not a status offense. You're just prosecuted because you are a gang member. You're only prosecuted when you actually commit this crime. And one of the key things from the prosecutor's perspective is that the Gang Act still allowed us to be flexible with defendants. We've used it quite a bit in DeKalb, and I'll get in that in a minute. But because of the flexibility, if we have a low-level gang member who's willing to testify against the others, we're able to fashion a sentence that is commensurate with his or her involvement of the gang, as opposed to having mandatory minimums where our hands are tied. So we like the flexibility where we can respond to the fact patterns that we have in front of us and make appropriate sentences that cause or encourage others to help us get the big fish, if you will. So, criminal street gang, an organization or association of 3 or more associated in fact, and again, that could be by how they dress, the colors that they wear, tattoos, gang symbols that they throw up. I think, or I recall, when we were debating this bill now 4 years ago, it was a question of, well, what if you have a basketball team or a football team? They're associated, in fact. They all wear uniforms. And again, this is not a status charge. That football team would have to go out and commit one of the crimes enumerated in the statute, which are the violent crimes, rape, aggravated sodomy. And so hopefully our football teams, basketball teams, Girl Scouts are only playing ball or doing community service. So the key here is that added element, hopefully, that they have to engage in what is defined as criminal gang activity. So, again, I talked about we have to show as prosecutors, this is the higher burden, that while the defendant is associated with a criminal street gang, that they actually participated in some kind of criminal gang activity, which is the underlying charge that we would be prosecuting anyway, whether it's an aggravated assault, a murder, armed robbery, and then through the commission of that underlying crime was associated with the gang. So this is the triangle that I was talking about in terms of normally as a prosecutor, I just have to show the defendant committed a crime, the bottom part of the triangle. When we start talking about gang act violations, I need to be able to show beyond a reasonable doubt that I can satisfy the top of the triangle as well, that that defendant is associated or employed, that the gang committed the gang activity or the crime, and that the person is also involved with that particular crime. So this is the nexus that we need to be able to show in order to be successful in a gang prosecution. So I know as we were debating or talking about the 2006 changes, the question inevitably came up, is this going to be constitutional? Is this something, is it going to come back on appeal that we're going to have to fix later on? And so our office is the one that handled the case in front of the Georgia Supreme Court. It was the case of State versus Rodriguez, or Rodriguez versus the State. There were individuals that were charged under the Gang Act violation for a murder that occurred at the Regal Cinemas up off of I-85 Access Road. And so the challenges by the defense in that were that the gang statute was vague and overbroad. They argued that the pattern requirement and in further its language was required, that you had to show several predicate acts beforehand. And then lastly, that that violates the First Amendment rights to be able to freely associate. And so my office, along with John Floyd, several have written amicus briefs in that case. Even Chairman Willard wrote an amicus brief in support of it for us. And thankfully the court found that not only, and I guess dealing with the issue that we all know about first, it says that acts of associating with compatriots in crime is not a protected right, meaning you cannot be protected, just like you can't yell fire in a theater, you cannot be free to group together to commit crimes. Additionally, the court ruled that it's not unconstitutionally vague and it's not unconstitutionally overbroad. It also rejected the arguments that the words pattern of and in furtherance of were constitutionally required. So the main concerns that were, I think, brought out or questions that were raised as we were enacting the statute, the Supreme Court ruled specifically on them. And the court held that it comports with the due process requirements because the way that this statute is tailored, it punishes conduct, not the association. Again, this is not a status offense. It's only when you actually commit a crime, when you commit a crime, that this statute is invoked. And I must say, one of the things that we were able to rely on quite a bit was the legislative intent that was included in the beginning of this statute. It was one of the first things that the Supreme Court went to in determining, is this an encroachment on anyone's constitutional rights? They said that there's no better source of legislative expression than finding the legislature's meaning of the act behind it. And very clearly in our act, it talked about we are not trying to encroach on anybody's constitutional rights. This is simply to respond to the state of crisis in our state based on the level of crime and violence that we're seeing. So again, that's one of the reasons why the legislative intent is very important, and we want to make sure that we adhere to all of the requirements of Rodriguez and anything that we're putting forth from this point out. The question is the Gang Act effective? I can sit here and tell you it absolutely is. Here in DeKalb, we've prosecuted about 50 defendants under this act so far for a total of just over 600 years in prosecution or in sentences. We've not had to have a single trial under this statute because most of the defendants plead. I'll let Mike tell you a funny story about that in just a second. But the other thing is that 2/3 of those sentences are on probation. So it's not something where there's mandatory minimums that you have to serve every day of whatever sentence is given out. We are able to tailor it based on each individual defendant's involvement in the gang. And as a result of this, DeKalb has been able to see a decrease in violent crime. We have a 46% decrease or 30% decrease in armed robberies, and then a 40% decrease in homicides. One of the other interesting things, and that could be related, those two stats can be related to several different things, but one of the key things is we had one particular gang that was responsible for 18 acts of violence in a 20-day period. Shooting at folks, lots of aggravated assaults, armed robberies during that time, and based on our ability to use this statute, we have now gone over 18 months without any violence from that particular gang. So again, we're able to use this as a tool to help all of our citizens remain safe. So with all of that, because we've used the statute so extensively, it became a question of can the Gang Act be improved in any way? And Chairman Golick came to us. He had indicated that he had some constituents that were concerned with some gang issues, notified the DA's Association, and they asked us to kind of do an assessment of what are we missing out of the statute, or the ways that we can improve it. And so we think we've come up with a couple of different ways. And again, we had 3 priorities in doing so. We wanted to make sure that we reinforced or bulwarked the 2006 improvements, didn't want to chip away at anything that we were able to achieve 4 years ago, but also enhance the statute by adding some provisions, and then obviously avoid any further constitutional challenges. We certainly don't want to open up ourselves to getting the statute thrown out. And so the suggestions that we have come in or can be grouped in 4 different categories: purpose and word choice, new offenses and sentencing requirements, rules of procedure, and then gang intelligence. And again, we're simply, everything that we do is to remain consistent with the Rodriguez case that upheld the constitutionality of the statute. Dealing with purpose and word choice first, one of the things that we saw is, although in 2006 the main goal was to remove the pattern of and in furtherance of language, there were a few places in the statute where it was overlooked. They were left in. And so we want to make sure that we remove all of those references to make it consistent, but also that we make it consistent in terms of using criminal street gang activity, or criminal street gang and criminal gang activity. There are a few areas where that's not consistent, and we want to make sure that we are. Also under purpose and word choice, because as I mentioned earlier, the legislative intent was one of the main things that the Supreme Court looked at in terms of upholding the statute. We want to make sure that the evidentiary code provisions of 1615.9 that are already in the statute are also added to the purpose section, so that if it's the will of this body to make sure that we can get into the evidence of the gang, that is explicitly stated, and again, it's stated in a way that does not infringe on any constitutional rights, so that if ever the Supreme Court goes back on that issue, the legislative intent is clear. expand the definition of criminal street gang to include common activities, customs, or behaviors. I've been in preliminary discussions with Sandy Michaels, and she probably or may come up and talk to you a little bit about it, and that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at. One of the reasons we put that in is because there are a lot of gangs, or as gangs get more sophisticated, they might not wear bandanas, blue bandanas, red bandanas. They might cover up their tattoos or opt not to have the obvious tattoos, but they still have their books of knowledge, which is pretty much the how-to book on gang customs, or they'll still have customs of initiation and those types of things that are in furtherance of or define the gang culture. And so we want to be able to stay current with gangs as they evolve and never let them get one step ahead of us. And then also to include the word associates in the evidence section. Again, based on the gang intelligence and gang culture, sometimes they distinguish between active members and those that are kind of in waiting, gang members in waiting. They're still involved with the gang. They know everything about it. They're still willing to live or die for the gang. And so we want to make sure that no one is excluded from prosecution when they still commit these crimes in hopes of being in the gang, or kind of as an initiation process. Also, in terms of, or next, looking at new offenses, sentencing requirements, we wanted to expand some offenses with respect to recruiting and retaliating. One of the things that you'll see as we go through the statute line by line, if that's the group's pleasure, is there's a section in there where you can be prosecuted if you commit a crime to elevate your status in the gang, such that you're in as a field member or a low-level member and you want to rise up to the next level. Then you can be prosecuted under the gang statute. However, if you were trying to commit a crime to get into the gang, and all of our intel suggests that there are initiation crimes, hit a lick here, or commit an armed robbery against this person, and we'll let you in, or go murder an opposing gang member, and we'll let you in. That's not a violation of the crime, and so, or violation of the gang statute. And so it's those types of things that we've been able to see just in practical application of the statute that we want to try to tighten a little bit to match the intel that we're having and the fact patterns that we're seeing. We want to make it mandatory that you can't have any further contact with victims of the crimes that these gangs commit, or with further gang members. Again, part of the reason we want to enact this statute is to disband the gangs entirely, whether that's by convicting the leadership or simply requiring that they do not associate and therefore not build up even further. And so we want to make sure that it's mandatory. There are some jurisdictions where they don't make it mandatory as a condition of either bond or the sentence. And then obviously we want to be able to maintain the flexibility in sentencing. There's no mandatory minimums in the statute, and we've seen that that's good practice in terms of enabling us to be able to do our jobs. In terms of the rules of procedure, we'd like to see that only Superior Court judges can set bond on gang offenses and add it to the list of things where judges are judges are able to do so. Again, I think that would just demonstrate this body's seriousness or willing to take gang violence serious, much like all of the other crimes that occur are listed in that statute. One of the things we also want to see is that probation must be fully completed. As I said, 2/3 of our defendants in DeKalb are currently on probation. Well, what better way to monitor increased gang activity or someone going back to the gang and getting reacquainted than if you require them to report once a month. And so again, it allows probation officers and police officers to keep current their intel and also act more quickly if someone does start to get more involved with the gang. And then last, again, is to protect victims and deter future gang involvement like I described earlier. The last main category deals with gang intelligence. We've spoken with the folks at the GBI and crafted this particular section in such a way that we would like them to have the authority to be able to create a statewide gang database where officers can upload their information. The statute is worded in such a way that it whenever the funds become available, so it's not really a fiscal note, there may be grant money out there, but we think it's smart that an officer in Lumpkin County know what an officer in DeKalb County knows about a gang in case somehow that they've crossed those county lines. We all know that crime doesn't stay within county lines, and so we want to make sure that the information about people that commit gang gang act violations is also able to transfer through the various law enforcement agencies. All of these things we're hoping will make Georgia safer. They are supported already by the Georgia Gang Investigators Association, and I believe we have Marco Silva here from the Gang Investigators Association, if you want to stand. And a representative from the Chiefs Association. I don't know if they've been in. Yes. So they're both in support of this. We've had no opposition from members of the GBI. I know Sherry Lang is here. The Department of Corrections also has a representative. The Board of Pardons and Paroles, or DJJ. We've done some groundwork and gotten their support, or at least no opposition as well. So we are prepared, if it's the chairman's pleasure, to kind of walk through the bill, to kind of explain each change, and then certainly, obviously, are also prepared to answer any questions that you might have.
Let me ask first of all, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I think that was an eye-opener for members of the committee. Let me ask whoever's closest so they could, thank you. I think what would be helpful, and my sense is that members of the committee have general questions about sort of the overview of what's going on out there in our state, and then maybe we'll go through a round or two of that, and then time permitting, and we'll see how many folks are here. And I appreciate you going through a few of the substantive changes on it. The bill itself, I think, is fairly straightforward. There are some questions, and even I have some questions about a couple of things that are in there right now, to make sure we're all on the same page and are writing the tightest statute that we can. The first thing I would ask you is, you mentioned initially in your presentation about a list of, on a county-by-county basis, of what's happening and where. I think a lot of us, not only elected, but the folks that we're privileged to represent, think that gang activity is really more of an urban phenomenon, that it's, or maybe suburban, but certainly not as much suburban as it is urban. When I hear someone like you and the folks you work with mention places like Whitfield County, Lamar County, I've spent a lot of time in Barnesville. I mean, that hits me quickly, and I think it does for the folks in those communities as well. We're all aware of crime everywhere, but more so in other places. And when you really start drilling down into the existence and the reality of such activity occurring in places like that, I think it would be helpful for members of the committee to have that list in total, so we can go ahead and just have a good eye-opening view of what that is. Now, does that come from your office or from
It does
GBI?
not. I'd have to defer to Mr. De Silva from the Gang Investigators Association.
Okay.
It's his folks that generated the list, and so they were
Well,
kind enough to share it with us. But I can give examples. I just don't know if I'd have to get his permission to turn over the list.
We'll make the inquiry there as well. As far as, again, just drawing from the presentation, I saw a very immediate connection between gang activity and drug activity. My sense, as it is with a lot of people, is that that's the money driver in the criminal enterprise and the overall criminal enterprise. What is the number one? Just confirm for me that is the primary activity within the primary business activity within the gang world, generally, from what
To the
you've seen.
to the extent that gangs are promoting a business in any sense, it is to move drugs. There are a lot of turf battles, and perhaps Mike can talk about some specific fact patterns that we've seen in DeKalb. But it is because of I don't know if it's. I mean, throughout Georgia, we have lots of major highways and those types of things, and we see the drug trade coming up, both from the south end and down from the north end. I think one of the interesting things is that Georgia has a lot of transplants from all over the country, and so whether they're coming from Chicago, coming from California, coming from other known gang havens, if you will, they're bringing that mentality, those resources with them here, and then looking for, that's one of the reasons why they're expanding into the suburban and rural areas, because they're looking for new territory to be able to set up where law enforcement might not be as well funded or have as many resources as we do here in the metro area to combat it. So they're trying to go to places where they think they'll be able to get over and do their crime and not encounter as much resistance from law enforcement.
What is the nexus between, I mean, given we've established that the drug trade is big within the gang world. That surprises no one. What is the nexus between that drug activity and the foreign drug trade? In other words, where's it coming from? What is the nexus between the drug activity being perpetrated by gangs here in this state? What is the nexus between that activity and foreign drug cartels?
I'll let Mike, because I think he's also got some fact patterns that talk specifically about them coming up from Mexico. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me recognize Mike Carlson and Morgan Perkins from the DeKalb DA's office. I know they've done a lot of work on this bill, along with their boss, Gwendolyn Keys Fleming. And I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize their hard work on it, and a lot of the back and forth drafting that occurred with Ms. Travis that will continue. But thank you for both of you for your hard work on that.
Well, it's certainly a privilege for us to be here and to discuss these issues, and of course, working with people like John Floyd, who volunteered so much of their time in the drafting and in the efforts, and of course, so many of the folks who are represented by or and seated behind us here from law enforcement and corrections, chief association, that sort of thing. I think we want to look at, when we talk about the way cases arise, there are two engines that are driving criminal gang activity in Georgia. You've got the economic engine, which of course is associated with illegal drugs. Then you've got your membership and activity engine, where the coin of the realm is violence. So the expectation of gang members as far as membership association, okay, is completely intertwined with the willingness to and capacity for violence. And of course, that violence protects and enhances the drug trade. So it's all too often the gang cases arise in terms of what we're able to indict and prosecute under the Gang Act due to a drive-by shooting, due to perhaps an armed robbery, strong arm robbery, some act of violence. But when we are able to prosecute criminal street gang members for their violent acts, we're of course also curtailing the drug activity in the state, because we're removing people who are going to be carving out drug activity, carving out drug territory, participating in the drug trade. Now, where does it come from in terms of foreign areas? What we've seen, and in some of the statistics that you have there in your fact sheets, is the same things that have brought people to Georgia legitimately in terms of the economy of this state, the attractiveness of Atlanta, the ability to come here from so many different directions, has also brought, unfortunately, criminal street gangs. And it's brought the criminal street gangs from Los Angeles, and it's brought the criminal street gangs from Chicago, and when I say from there, in terms of their base, and it's also brought the ones from Mexico and Central America heavily. In terms of what the numbers are, we could certainly have plenty of folks here besides me who could describe that. But again, our office, along with many other DA's offices, but works very, very closely with the Gang Investigators Association and with the Chiefs Association in examining these trends. And what we see in terms of the way gangs have expanded, and we have, let's say, the 18th Street Gang, which was the base gang for the Rodriguez decision. The underlying case was a mistaken identity homicide. A group of 18th Street members and associates spotted two young people going basically on a date to a movie, believed they were rival gang members from Sur 13, got out of the car, drove up on them in a parking lot of a Regal Cinema, whereas Mr. Floyd said, "This is where America goes to movies." Confronted him, asked the young man, because of what he was wearing, "Who do you claim?" which is asking him what gang he's in. Attacked him and the young lady. When he started winning the fist fight, they came out with bats and a gun, attacked them both, shot them both, murdering him. Now, the interesting thing about that is 18th Street Gang starts on 18th Street in Los Angeles. The Sur 13 Gang has its basis in the California penitentiary system, where the Sureños, or the inmates from Southern California, banded together. Well, now what we have persistently in DeKalb County and across the state of Georgia are people from Mexico, Central America, who are 18th Street members, SIR 13 members, who have never been to California. They came straight from Mexico through Texas to Georgia to commit crimes. Gangster Disciples, prevalent gang with its roots in Chicago and the Cabrini Ring Housing Project. Georgia case law decision after case law decision, cases I've prosecuted in other circuits going back over a decade with Gangster Disciples. You'll have people from Chicago at times coming down, setting up enclaves, but very often you'll have people who have never been to Chicago, might not even be able to point to Lake Michigan on a map, who identify as Gangster Disciples, are thoroughly acquainted with Gangster Disciple culture, in particular the violence that's expected of members and associates, and are committing crimes as Gangster Disciple criminal street members here in Georgia and spreading the gang. So we think foreign, we have other states and other countries.
I appreciate the response, but just to put a finer point on it, from your investigations, have you made a direct link between the drugs that these individuals are peddling as part of the gangs here with their sourcing coming from a foreign nation?
Absolutely. I mean, that's well known.
Okay.
That's very well known in law enforcement circles.
I just wanted to go ahead and make sure we connected the dots on that.
It would not be every incident of where the drugs are coming from, but certainly it is well known and something law enforcement would stipulate.
My final question for this round, and then I want to go around the table, is, and I touched upon this before, we have a very stereotypical image in our minds of gang activity driven, frankly, from the media. And that's not by way of criticism, it's just a statement of reality. My sense of it is that it's not so in your face these days. Now, there's no doubt a lot of that. Talk to me about what is the reality in terms of the subtleties that are now being employed by these criminal enterprises, because that's what they are. It seems to me there's more of a level of sophistication from what I have learned in terms of the actions of these gangs and these criminal enterprises. Talk to us about how that sophistication has evolved. What are the subtleties that are being employed right now that allow them to elude law enforcement to whatever degree they are eluding it? And then talk to us about infiltration in our school systems and at what levels.
Well, if I could take your last point first,
yeah,
and
sure.
Those of you that are lawyers, you may know I feel like moot court now, if I can take them in the reverse order. In terms of in our school systems, gangs now are in every school system, at least in DeKalb County, that we can, and obviously I can only speak definitively about one county, but I'm assuming it translates into others. They are not only in our high schools, and not only among students that you would think are either at risk or doing poorly. We had intel that a few years ago, the valedictorian of one of our high schools was a gang member, specifically recruited because of his intelligence, his status, if you will, and so he was underground as a gang member, but still helping out with, the organizing the armed robberies or the shakedowns and all of that. So not only is it at the high school level, but we are now seeing it in our elementary schools. And you might think, why are our children, our babies, getting involved with gangs? It's because their older siblings, parents, different cousins, family members are blessing them in. I think the way that we would have an affinity for, if you're a UGA grad, you want to have your legacy of your son, daughter graduate from UGA, that same kind of mentality is now being adopted by gangs. I want my cousin in as a gangster disciple. I want my nephew, my little brother, my little sister. And so we're also starting to see some of the lead gang members, ones that are clearly adults, mid to late 20s, early 30s, using juveniles to commit the crimes that they want to commit simply because juveniles are treated, they're adjudicated in juvenile court, treated rehabilitated, if you will, treated less harshly. And so that's an example of how the intel, how they're trying to do it in a more subtle fashion. One of the other things in terms of sophistication that we're seeing now is the internet, MySpace, Facebook. A lot of the cases that we have, they post videos to MySpace, YouTube, or whatever, where they are bashing the opposing gang members. The opposing gang members then see that, do their own videos back, and we had some pretty graphic videos from cases that we've prosecuted in DeKalb County. Certainly, I don't know that that's the kind of thing for this audience, but we can send you the disc if you do want to see it. And so they're using that behind the scenes. And so it's not so much the tagging that you see on the street as but you do see that still. But there's a lot more going on under the radar, if you will, that is putting all of us in jeopardy. So it's those types of subtleties. Some of the tagging, and we should have included a photo, but anytime you see things like pitchforks or upside down pitchforks, the Star of David versus a 5-star. One of the things that always sticks out in my mind is K-Swiss. The words K-Swiss, S-W-I-S-S, means kill a slob when I see a slob. Well, that is a Crip derogatory term against Bloods, if I'm not mistaken. Correct. So it's a whole bunch of knowledge that you learn every day. And so unless you you might think, well, K-Swiss, those are the kind of sneakers that we wore way back when. Well, it's a whole new meaning nowadays. And so that's some of the subtleties, their own separate language. Others include, I guess, writing upside down G's whenever they write something on a wall. That is a derogatory term, I believe, to gangster disciples. So it's those types of things that our officers have spent a great deal of time learning and being able to recognize that we as ordinary citizens, it may just look like graffiti to us. So that's some of the examples, and I think I've answered your questions, but please tell me if I missed something.
Well, we're not going anywhere. Mr. Levitas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for bringing this bill forward. And another thing I want to add to the discussion about why this is so important, it's not just the gang members and the gang activities, but even in my neck of the woods, which is a very suburban area of northeast DeKalb, what you're seeing is what the police will call wannabes. Mm-hmm. And those tend to be just kids who may be 2 or 3 folks who are adopting the gang symbols, even if they're not members. But if we don't stop the gang activity, those are exactly the kind of people that can be sucked into the gangs themselves. And so it's a problem, I know, in my area, and I would assume all over the state. So I appreciate your bringing this forward. I had a couple of just quick questions about the database that you mentioned, which I think is a good idea, but I do have questions about whether it would be a separate database, the cost, can it be integrated as part of an existing database? How would that actually be implemented?
That was something that we wanted to be able to leave to the freedom of the GBI. They know what local sheriffs and law enforcement can provide and what they can't. We know that there are some jurisdictions that might not be as technologically advanced. And so we didn't want to dictate to them how best to get their information when they may have a good idea on how to do it. In terms of the cost, I don't know that we've gotten a dollar amount for that, but that's one of the other reasons that we're not asking necessarily that it be funded this year. We all know the economic challenges that we're having. But to the extent that grants are available, we want to make sure that the avenue, if you will, to be able to go out and get those grants and be able to create this is there. And to your point, interestingly enough, in DeKalb, you're right, it is not just in low socioeconomic communities. One of the things that we saw, we were chosen by the National District Attorneys Association to be one of 6 jurisdictions that received help from national experts. And when we took them out on a ride-along, they were absolutely amazed that we have gangs in areas where the houses start at $400,000. I mean, it's not just apartment complexes and that kind of thing. Some of the most notorious intersections are in the middle of school districts, whether it's, I want to say South Harrison and Redan. So, and those are very affluent neighborhoods. I mean, mom and dad with great jobs and kids that might have too much time on their hands or get involved in these wannabe gangs. We call them hybrids. And in actuality, what we found is that they're actually more dangerous because they're trying to establish their street cred. And so if you call them a wannabe, they get upset and they want to go out and prove that they are legitimate, and that's when they start committing these violent crimes.
And then just one other question, which is really just a process question. How, and again, fully in support of everything that you're trying to do, as far as the association, how do you actually enforce that? Excuse me, enforce that. There was a provision there where we would make mandatory the prohibition against associating with gang members. In terms of catching or monitoring, how would that work? Is it just a officer on patrol who happens to see these folks? I mean,
are you talking about during the term of probation?
Term of probation.
The way we envision that, I mean, much like folks who are on probation might have to submit to a drug test, or the same way we enforce a no violent contact provision as if it was an aggravated assault against somebody else at school, let's say, that you cannot have contact with. So we would be able to contact that victim, get street intelligence either from the school to see whether this person has been in touch with other gang members, and then ask them about it when they come in. Look to see, are there new tattoos that they have gotten, those types of things. It just gives us the opportunity to ask more questions and make sure that nothing has changed from the time that they promised not to have any further contact. So again, that's something we would defer to the probationers. They know that job best. They've done it in relation to staying away from drugs and victims in other contexts, and we just want to make sure they're able to do it here as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Franklin.
Thank you. Could you refresh me, what was the percentage of the criminal activity associated with the drug traffic? It was pretty high, if I recall.
It is high. I don't have an exact percentage, and so I don't want to speak out of turn. We can go back. We can go back and look for it for you, but I believe
I remember just seeing that in the slide.
Let me go back and check here. We had a couple of different slides on that issue. One of the things that we tried to do too is take out some of the slides so that we wouldn't be here all day. Obviously, we could talk about it forever.
Because if the prevalent criminal activity is associated with the retail trade of drugs, I recall back in the time period in our country between 1919 and 1933, there was a lot of criminal street gang violence, shootings, murders, deaths associated with the drug trade between that period of time until the 21st Amendment passed to remove the government prohibition of that particular drug.
Mm-hmm.
That was the retail trade during that the street gangs were doing in that time.
Okay.
And I was wondering if y'all had given any thought to remedying the crime part of the equation the same way they did with the 21st Amendment.
To be honest, sir, we hadn't thought about it. Okay. And it's not something, I guess, that we're necessarily opposed to, but in reference to the slide I think that you were talking about is, if we can go back to the one where the graph with all of the different types of drugs, the kinds of things that we're seeing where agencies are reporting seeing drugs above the 50% level included powder cocaine, marijuana. It was consistently above 50% for the last 3 years, and then certainly still recognizable in years before that. I think the difference here, though, is one of the components of gangs is their violent acts to protect territories. And so even with the link to drug trades, they're still going to be out there committing violence and I don't know if you're suggesting that we legalize these particular types of drugs.
I'm not making any suggestion at
okay.
all. I was just wondering, since you had the violence along with the territories during that when a certain drug of choice was not granted sanction by the government, and there were turf wars. That's where a lot of the shootings and the violence and the murders and the deaths were coming from. So I was just wondering if there was any correlation with that, and if you could address another one, just to try to help me understand. There's the underlying offense to this, like say armed robbery, and then the violation with the street gang additional offense is on top of that. So I'm trying to get how that is not really a status offense. If it's how is it proven that the person who committed the armed robbery, is it just because they were a member of the criminal street gang, or is it that it was an armed robbery that was approved by the criminal street gang,
or done at the direction of?
Right, but is it just so it has to be somehow or other linked not just to membership, but some other directive, or that's what I'm trying to understand.
Yes, and perhaps it would be better for Mike to explain some of the specific fact patterns that he has. But let me, if I could go back to your first point, I think one of the things to understand, and John just wrote me this note, is even when they ended Prohibition, it did not end Cosa Nova, the Mafia, and all of that kind of stuff. So even if we get to the point of dealing with the substance that they are trafficking, if you will, whether it's alcohol or drugs, I think you're still going to see a lot of the things that we're talking about here. And I'll have Mike explain some of the fact patterns to hopefully answer your last question.
Right, and I'm going to also defer to Mr. Floyd to further explain it legally. One thing I think we want to differentiate and understand, and this is a further answer to Chairman Golick's question about the gangs, particularly that come here from south of our border, and that whether they started in America or not, but certainly that come from there. Being a member of a gang is part of an identity that the members and associates have, or being part of the gang. It's not exclusive. So most of these folks that are in MS-13 or SIR-13 or 18th Street work a job in any number of places that you can imagine, legitimate jobs. But their identity, as far as being part of that gang and, quote, representing it, is also a critical part of their identity. And innately in that identity is violence. It's an expectation of members and associates. It's a demand for admission. And for people who fail, it is something that can be set upon them. There are severe punishments for not being violent in these gangs, against other gang members, against law enforcement, against law-abiding citizens. And that's part of a culture and a set of behaviors and customs that are completely separate and distinct from the drug traffic. That makes these gangs identifiable. And so we get to then how the gang statute works. Now, I was at a RICO seminar that Mr. Floyd hosted recently, and Professor Blakey from Notre Dame Law School, who was the author of the original RICO statute, mentioned that there was not a successful mafia prosecution in America until after 1970. And the reason for that was that's when the RICO laws came along. And it wasn't because the RICO laws provided more punishments. It's because the RICO laws provided a conduit by which the evidence of all of the connections of the mafia and all of their activities, and why not only perhaps this person in the case is dead, but why garbage costs $25 more than it ought to get taken out, and why that bridge on the other side of town hasn't been built yet, and how all of those things interrelate to the mafia activity. Well, this is what our Gang Act does in Georgia, is when that three-part nexus can be formed that's in the handouts and on the screen, where there's a connection between the offense, the criminal street gang, and the individual that then allows us to give the jury the complete picture and the context of this particular crime. And just like when we want people voting in elections to be as fully as informed as possible, when they vote in a jury box, we want them to be as fully informed as possible. So when we have, in cases like we've had in DeKalb County, a young man getting beaten up when he's walking home with school because he says, quote, I don't represent anybody, we need to be able to advise the jury that this is not just a simple battery. This is retaliation for someone refusing to be part of a gang, or for perhaps to be part of another gang. And at that point, the background and the context of what the gang in question, the criminal street gang in question does, its history, how it operates, then becomes relevant.
I guess in short, too, it goes to motive. It clearly goes to motive. It explains, like in the Regal Cinema murder, Why did the defendants approach the victim? Because they believed him to be part of a rival gang. Well, what does it mean to be part of a rival gang? What gang are the defendants a part of? What gang did they think the victim was a part of? So again, it goes to the motive behind the underlying crime and why they're willing to commit whatever acts of violence they're committing. It takes it out of just the vacuum, if you will, and it allows us to explain it in the larger context.
So I understand you've got the underlying crime, say the aggravated assault or armed robbery. Mm-hmm. I'm still trying to get the handle on if the person that is being accused of that is when you're also bringing the gang statute to play. Is it do you have to show that? How do you have to say, well, here's this person instructed my suspect to do it, or they took a vote and the suspect was the one that got the short straw and was the one tasked with doing the armed robbery? How do you actually show, or is it just because they're associated with the street gang?
No, it's much more of just, it's not the association process. I mean, some of the fact patterns that we have are where a leader in the gang has directed a juvenile to commit an armed robbery, mm-hmm. whether it's to get into the gang, whether it's to retaliate against somebody else. And so the investigation, the police's investigation, not only does not stop at just the armed robbery of the convenience store or armed robbery of whatever. Based on what they see at the scene, based on what signs the defendant may have thrown up after the shooting or before, based on what witnesses might have heard at the time of the shooting, that all relates back to gang activity. And so that's when we would know this is not an ordinary armed robbery of just a convenience store.
So then you go and look. Now you've got some clues that there might be more involved. Now you go to find who gave the order for him to do it. It's not just that he was in the gang, but you've got to go find.
That's correct.
Okay.
And it might be, the case in point, it might be that activity or what limited information they get on the scene leads to a search warrant, or at the defendant's house you now see a book of knowledge. And in the book of knowledge it says, so-and-so ordered me to do this to so-and-so, or I need to do this armed robbery to be able to get into the gang. So it allows us to kind of build the blocks, put the pieces together to show the larger puzzle, that this is really part of an ongoing terroristic or violent enterprise, not just one armed robbery that looks isolated.
Thank you.
Mr. Everson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Keys, thank you so much. As one of the co-authors of 2006 statute, I thank you very much for this. Several questions here, just for my own knowledge and edification here. Thank you for the educational component that you have in your gang unit. We have a similar gang unit in Gwinnett County who's doing tremendous work, and I see you've had remarkable success in DeKalb County.
And DA Danny Porter is in support of this as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I've always been curious why anyone would become affiliated with such a group, a gang, and I see you have enumerated several reasons why a person would join a gang. Is there one overriding compelling factor that you have identified that compels a person to join gangs?
It's difficult to identify one because every defendant and every gang is different. I think if you had to draw comparisons, it goes back to gangs generally provide a sense of belonging, and we all want to belong to something. And if we come from a situation where family members are either part of a gang or don't provide support in a legitimate legal environment, then you just have that natural human need to want to belong somewhere. So they're able to capitalize on that. I think, too, some of it sometimes is fear. What we're seeing in our high schools is kids are terrified not to be covered in a way. They feel if they are not affiliated with a gang, then they have no one to stand up for them. And so they join just simply because I've got to be able to survive in this threatening, violent world. Let me align myself with somebody who can give me cover, who's got my back, and then I can have their back as well. So those would be the two probable most common. But again, every situation is different, and so I don't really want to make generalities, but if forced, then those would be the two.
Well, thank you so much. And we've always heard that gangs are in low economic areas, and I represent a very affluent area in Gwinnett County. And I can assure you that they are present in Gwinnett County, and Gwinnett County is aggressively addressing that upfront as well. But in your map, you show that it's not only in the urban areas, but it's going to the rural areas. Is there one concentrated geographical area that you see the movement going towards versus others, or it's just...
That might be a question better suited for the gang investigators. What I have is kind of the list of, if I was to count, and forgive me, my Georgia geography is not as good, so a lot of the counties I don't recognize. But let's say, for example, Liberty County, we were able to trace, or the Georgia gang investigators.
Hinesville.
Is that Hinesville?
Hinesville.
Okay. 55 different reported gangs in that area. If you look at, trying to find things that are not metro area, Columbia County, 29, Barrow County, 30, Bibb County, 50. These are different reported gangs. Ware County, 27, Whitfield, 18, Lamar County, 36, Cherokee County, 82. So that gives you some idea. And again, these are conservative numbers because it's only when law enforcement officers actually attend this seminar and are polled that they are able to say what intel they've gotten. And that's the other reason why the database would be so important, because then it's not only reaching officers that attend this one particular class, but it would reach all officers.
Well, thank you so much. One final question, Mr. Chairman. You've had tremendous success in DeKalb County. You mentioned that one particular gang prosecuted under the current statute, they've gone 18 months without any activity. What's the recidivism rate of some gang members that have been prosecuted, placed on probation? Do you have some stats to say they've become reunited with gangs?
I don't have any stats right now, and I think it's still new. I mean, those that committed acts in 2007 or 2008, they're just now coming to court, and I think might only be on probation or under sentence for a year or so. So I've not had the opportunity to go back and ask probation officers in those cases what they're seeing, but I can certainly do that and get that information for you.
Thank you so much, and I support the legislation.
Oh, Mike has sent me a note that they've had only 2 revocation hearings out of
Only
the 5th.
2?
Only 2 out of the... And it was not for gang activity.
Mr. Mangum.
One of the best DAs in Georgia.
Pull your microphone. Could you pull your microphone toward you?
See, my chairman says he didn't hear that, too. One of the best DAs.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
And staff, thank you for being here. And I'm sorry I was had a little conflict this morning in being here. I thank you for bringing this legislation, and I have not gotten a chance to really read it, and I don't want you to go over everything, but I just heard you say that evidence of motive, for example, the example that a guy was beat up when he said he didn't want to be a member of a gang, for example. Because I do not practice law, do not want in criminal law, and I do not have any desire to do, and have not done it since the first couple of years of my law practice. Evidence, that type of evidence would not be admissible because of motive. You couldn't show motive because of that situation?
In the past, no. Not to the extent that we could do now.
Okay.
Because the competing thing, and this I think was debated quite a bit when the 2006 version was enacted, the competing thing is the defendant's character. And so the way this statute has been crafted and the way it's been approved by the Supreme Court, they do, and in some instances even out of the gang context, courts will allow you to go into a defendant's character for limited purposes. And so we have, or y'all, not we, crafted the 2006 version tightly enough that we are able to get into not just the motive for that one instance back and forth, but how that one instance plays into the bigger enterprise of committing violence. Again, how it's part of the initiation culture or custom of this gang. And so There's a specific statute provision in the statute that deals with evidence and being able to get into this, and that's one of the things we're asking y'all to include in the legislative purpose, again, because we know the Georgia Supreme Court is going to look to y'all's intent on what you want us to be able to go into, and we just want to make sure that intention of allowing us to go into it is clear and unquestionable.
Thank you. And I remember seeing a very, very revealing video at your, I don't know whether it was seen here, but there are affluent kids, and they're everyone, every strata. I'm just amazed with the. What amazes me is I see white kids with a I mean, I see certain kids looking a certain way, and it's like it amazes me. I'll just leave it like that.
Well, and unfortunately now I think it's cool to become a gang, be a part of a gang member.
It is, and with the tattoos and with everything. But let me ask this question: what is the most controversial provision that you are proposing today that the other side is going to not want, so that I can get to the
Sandy
crux?
agrees with everything.
So that I can kind of get to the.
I think overwhelmingly we are in agreement. I got a chance to talk to Sandy shortly this morning, and I think she's identified some issues that we've been willing to go back and work on. I think one of the things, and Sandy, I certainly don't want to take your thunder, but the part of the statute where we talk about being able to go into the culture, customs, those types of things of gang activity, she's concerned that it's overbroad. When we talk about adding the word associates to the evidentiary position, they have a concern about that. She also indicated requiring to report for the entire time of probation. Thinks that might be unduly burdensome. And again, I don't want to put words in her mouth. This was literally a 2 or 3 minute conversation, and I don't know if I've missed anything.
Well, we'll get to it. I mean, we'll get to it in due
But
course.
those would be the areas that we're willing to talk and work through with them as well.
Thank you.
Ms. Bird.
Thank you so much. Recently, I have sat in with the Cherokee Sheriff's Department to do something very similar to what you presented today. So thank you very much. With the downturn of the economy, is gang activity up, and are more people joining gangs to use it of ways to for income?
I think that, again, I hate to defer, but it might be a better question for the gang investigators, because the statute was put into effect in 2006. I did not get my prosecutor until 2007, and in 2007 we were starting to see, and through 2008, starting to see the downturn. So I don't know that we actually have the stats of the 2006 statute prior to the economic downturn, simply because we didn't have the resources in place to be able to gain them. So I don't want to say we don't have it. But there was so much change going on, I'd be hesitant to quantifiably say that it is going up. I can tell you that crime is going up. There's certainly the identity thefts, we've seen a decrease in violent crime, but just about drugs, just the overall drug cases have gone up, and presumably, again, that's because people are turning to drugs because of the economy, or might be looking for that other source of income. But that's a difficult question for me to answer, just because there's so many variables. But I can try to research it again if we can ask the gang folks, the gang investigators, if they have it.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you
Sure.
very much, District Attorney Keys Fleming, Mr. Carlson, Mr. Perkins, Ms. Perkins, Mr. Floyd. I appreciate it very much. But what I want to do is I do want to hear from Mr. Silva with the Georgia Gang Investigators Association. I think he has the answers to some questions that have been asked in terms of prevalence and growth and percentage rates and so forth, to the extent that he can answer them. I definitely want him to come up and let's hear from him and ask him some good questions. We'll break at lunchtime, and then we'll continue this next week and give committee members the opportunity to take a look at the language in there. There are a couple of questions with regard to evidence-related questions and admissibility and hearings, and making sure that we're keeping it on an even track, even as we go ahead and seek to increase the tools at the prosecutor's disposal. So, again, thank you to the DeKalb DA team.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much. And let me ask Mr. Silva, Mr. Marco Silva with the Georgia Gang Investigators Association, to please come forward. Over here, if you don't mind. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you very much. Mr. Silva, in hearing what we've heard, and then in hearing some of the questions from the membership, and occasionally hearing that you're in the best position to answer certain questions, it lends me to believe that you are the tip of the sword in this battle, aren't you?
Well,
You're the tip of the sword.
We're doing what we need to do for the state of Georgia.
Thank you. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for doing what you do. There's a lot that occurs that we don't see and that our constituents don't see. But if it doesn't get done, they're going to see things that they don't want to see.
Correct.
Is my sense of it. So, again, we appreciate your commitment and your service to our communities collectively. Let me ask you to make whatever statement you want to make that either goes to what it is you do on a daily basis, what you've seen, your career, what you saw when you first started, what you're seeing now.
Yes, sir.
What are the differences? What are the challenges, and how have they evolved? To the extent that you want to attempt to answer questions that you may have heard already, great. If you don't, this group's not shy. They'll ask again. So let me just open it up to you, and again, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm Investigator Marco Silva. I'm a Gwinnett County police officer. I've been in law enforcement about 18 years, over 12 of that as an investigator. I served my country in the Marine Corps, in military. There was gangs. I did do my part in Desert Storm, Desert Shield. But I grew up in Chicago. I migrated from Mexico to Chicago, and I was part of a criminal street gang myself. And what I grew up seeing in Chicago for 10 years of my gang life was the laws, no support, what I felt the inner city didn't have at that time. But I see we have that here in Georgia, which is great. But I saw when one's going in the military, I saw there is more out there in the world than what is just in your area. But if you're stuck within your area, you need to have some kind of support, something to do. Of my 18 years as law enforcement officer, I spent over 8 of that as a gang investigator. And when I first went into gang investigations, seeing what we had here in Georgia, became a law enforcement officer, I saw that we got together and we saw what the gang law had to offer in 1992. Respectfully, it wasn't much. A lot of officers didn't understand it. I've been through 2 academies, one as a sheriff's deputy and one as a Gwinnett police officer. And at that time, they didn't really touch on gangs because the mentality in Georgia, it appeared, was we don't have them, so we don't really need to worry about them. But as an investigator looking back at some cases, I noticed that there were cases with gang involvement since the early mid-'80s, and nobody really gave it much attention. But seeing what we had there, myself and a dozen or so officers creating what is known as the Georgia Gang Investigators Association 1998. As co-founder and president of the association, we have 2 main objectives. One is continuously work on this law we have to make it better for not only law enforcement but the citizens of the state of Georgia. And the other is to educate as many people in the state of Georgia as possible, which we do annually for law enforcement, which we do by request by just about any citizen group. We are a nonprofit association. That is our main objectives. This is my second tour as a gang investigator in Gwinnett County Police, now as one of the supervisors. We see from when I first started law enforcement in '91 till now, we're seeing that what was happening then, it has grown a lot more now. Gwinnett County, I'm not here to insult my county. What I'm here to tell you is Gwinnett County has more youth than any county in the state of Georgia. You ask about numbers and population in counties. With our most populated county with over 800,000 people, there are gangs there. But then when you look at our least populated county with just over 2,000 people, there are gangs there. They showed you a list that we had up there of gangs. How did we identify it? By speaking to these law enforcement agencies and to the citizens of those jurisdictions is how we came up with our numbers of the activity of gangs within those. I went to rural South Georgia to give a class, And it was surprising that people down there saw me as a Hispanic officer and said, they allow Hispanics to be officers in Georgia. Surprising. They said, well, and they were being honest. We thought mostly you come here to work or you're involved with the gangs and drugs. And that was the mentality. Until they saw that it is not somebody else's problem, it's everybody's problem. So this is what we do today now, and we're working with our political leaders and our agencies. Gwinnett County Police is very supportive. As of 2002, I know of no police academy, sheriff's academy, no law enforcement academy that does not teach gangs. In Gwinnett County, we started in 1998. We were ahead of the game because I spoke to some of the most seasoned officers, investigators of Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. And when speaking to them what we're doing in Georgia, the best remembrance of an answer I got was, it's good you're doing something because I wish we did something different decades ago. And I asked, what was it you didn't do? He said, we didn't do a damn thing. So Georgia, I get invited to many states, many jurisdictions to speak. I go testify in many courts, state and federal, on gangs because it seems we're ahead of the game. And with this law changes and updates, I think that's going to keep us ahead of the game.
Can you speak to what, and I realize that you're based in Gwinnett, but you have statewide exposure.
Yes, sir.
And you're aware of areas and how certain areas have changed, evolved, or devolved, as the case may be, in terms of their exposure to gang activity over the course of the last really nearly 20 years, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can you identify, and if you can't do it or don't feel comfortable doing it orally here, we can certainly maybe get a written exhibit at some point in the near future. Where have you seen the biggest rates of increase?
Metro Atlanta.
Can you be more specific?
Well, Metro Atlanta consists of its 28 counties. The growth in Gwinnett, because we have over 20% of our population is kids, we are one of the counties that seems drug gangs and criminal street gangs want our babies. When I talk about babies, I talk about anyone under 25 and under usually, but that is what you need to look for. And with the nearly 10 million population in the state of Georgia, just over 6 million of that here in Metro Atlanta, of course, that's what they want. Here's where the money, here's where the growth is at. But with that, you can go all the way down to Lowndes and Tiff near the state line, and you got gang activity. You can go to the shores, of Savannah, there's gang activity. You can go to Columbus, Georgia, even Chattanooga, you got gang activity. But the growth is where there's going to be any gain for these individual groups.
Is it your sense that if it was there before, it's much more prevalent now? If it hasn't, if it wasn't someplace then, it is someplace now, and if it's not at all right now, it's only a matter of time before it's coming.
That's correct. I heard the term someone say wannabes, and it is a very dangerous word to say to these gang members. We teach law enforcement officers not to make that statement. You're not a gangster, you're a wannabe. You're going to make them angry and they're going to do something silly.
Right.
So you take it for what they say they are, and you learn from that.
Mr. Ramsey. Mr. Sessler.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. In your opinion, what specific tools, if you could say one or two or three things that Georgia law enforcement officers need now that the code doesn't allow them to do now, what would those things be? Again,
I think Georgia Gang Investigators Association has been part of the modification changes of this law since it came to exist in '92 to presently. This is, I believe, the fourth or fifth time. As changes go with the modernization of gangs, he brought to the attention of back in the early 1900s when you think about the alcohol and drugs, what changes were made. That's exactly what we're doing today. As far as the changes he's presenting to you, yes, we need to continuously be able to identify these gangs. Will it always be by the identification of that tattoo, that color he's wearing? No, will not be. And we're seeing that now. Some of our gangs we've investigated, we discover are no longer allowing their members to tattoo themselves with their gang identification, thinking this will be a way to keep us from prosecuting them. So many of those changes, I agree, just every change on there.
Mr. Ramsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you being here. I'm not going to miss an opportunity to ask such a great resource. I guess just an informational question. I represent a district south of here in Fayette County. Peachtree City is my primary, the primary population base of my district. Very affluent, overwhelmingly Caucasian. And I'm just curious, from your perspective and all your experience in gangs, I don't see we don't see the tagging down there. We haven't had drive-by shootings, but my law enforcement officials tell me that it's certainly a growing concern. What's the mode of operation for these street gangs to infiltrate a place like my home community, where again, it's primarily white, affluent, a pretty tight-knit community? What's the signs we need to be looking for? What is the gang's mode of operation for getting into communities like mine?
Many gangs will begin with the decay of certain areas, even with prevalent areas that are, high priced. It's going to begin with the graffiti, okay? With the empty homes, I live in a community, my subdivision, $125,000 homes. It's not that big. Giant houses or anything, but we have 101 houses. Of that, we have 4 that are empty presently. Of that, something like 15 that are rental. And those are the kinds of things they have to keep an eye on, because we notice that if you don't, they begin the tagging and they want to move in on there, they look for a community such as that where they can look at how many kids you have in your community, and they're going to learn pretty quickly. We learned real quick that it's our middle school level is where they're going to really begin to move in on our kids. And when they discover you have that kind of level kids in your community, then that's where they're going to try it. They'll grab probably one of the weakest minded, or one of those that have really not much to do or lack of confidence, and move in on that individual. And believing that he's getting support from these gangs, he's going to cause a lot of problems. I've always heard throughout the years that our neighborhood's good. These are kids that come from somewhere else. Actually, a lot of it begins in your community, from your own kids in your community. So that is what we need to look for. Fayette County does have gangs. People joke about the home of the golf carts, right? But you do have that activity out there. Look at some of your, respectfully, golf carts that have been stolen, and the groups who have been taking them, for what reasons. And if there's a monetary gain to purchase drugs and weapons, that's what you got to look for. As your investigators, you do have Fayette County officers that are part of GGIA, and we work with them on a regular basis. We meet with them also once a month to know what's going on in their communities.
So from your perspective, communities like mine that I specifically Fayette County, where we aren't as, I guess, advanced in terms of the level of gang activity as at Fulton or DeKalb or maybe even Gwinnett, just because our population is so much less. Is there a pretty good level of communication between the law enforcement agencies, specifically with respect to my own home county?
Yes, I've worked with your Peachtree City Police, their crime prevention community, Fayette County gang investigators, and we don't just talk about the gangs. We ask about, what are you doing community-wise? What are you doing with your jurisdictions within your county, the political leaders, the community leaders? It all needs to work together. And the reason it needs to work together, of all this, I've heard for decades now about what should we do? More time in prison, or more type of home groups, more probation? To me, the biggest thing we got to look at before they join is what Peachtree is pretty good at. Is what you do is you give them activities, keep them busy. They ain't got time for that gang garbage. So if you're trying to get how Peachtree's looking, you're looking pretty good. But yes, sir, you do have gang activity.
Well, thank you.
Speaking about your exposure to other police departments or the law enforcement agencies in general, but of course, locals where the rubber hits the road. Is there a police, in general, do police agencies, local police agencies throughout the state, police departments, do they all have some sort of gang unit, gang in office, or at least officers who spend most of their time on gang-related activities, maybe not in the context of a formal investigatory unit within the Smyrna Police Department or wherever? in your knowledge, and maybe it's a question better suited for Mr. Caldwell with the associations of chiefs of police, but from your exposure over the last 20 years, I mean, do most police departments have someone doing this? Do they have a you?
Yes, sir. From my from my exposure experiences with numerous law enforcement agencies, presently Gwinnett County has 7 gang investigators, and we're also part of the FBI Safe Streets Task Force, which they have 7 of in the state of Georgia, and there is long-term prosecution. But in dealing with them, and also GGIA putting up a week training conference for numerous law enforcement officers, and we also, since being nonprofit, anything we can also gather together. We invite law enforcement officers from smaller jurisdictions that would, in other words, not be able to attend any kind of training because of budgets within that agency. With that, those agencies really have no gang investigator, so many times I discover that they put it on the shoulders of their detective, and their detective can be overwhelmed with what he's got already, but he does need to be, or she does need to be, knowledgeable on other criminal activity besides investigating their cases. So there are numerous jurisdictions that have just that one individual, and that one individual working on their own will not do it. But we push that they work with everyone else. In Gwinnett County, we've never denied anybody any information on any subject we may have. We've assisted in recently, actually, out of Powder Springs, identified a criminal street gang member of a home invasion, armed robbery. We spent a lot of time on it. I think most of us didn't sleep for 48 hours, but we knew this guy needed to be arrested. So giving support to smaller agencies, this is what larger agencies do. And Georgia Gang Investigators, we work with many chiefs and sheriffs agencies to try to make that work better.
You mentioned in response to Mr. Ramsey's question, I think, having to do with when you have areas of a city, of a jurisdiction where you have, I think you used the word decay or something like that. It's just abandoned homes, dilapidated buildings.
Yes, sir.
I mean, the word we use here in the property context, of course, is blight.
Right.
Where you have, you've got blight, whether it's urban, suburban, exurban, rural, whatever it may be. That ends up being a base for these gangs to, have some place to go that's theirs, going back to Ms. Keyes-Fleming reference to a sense of belonging.
Right.
Their new home, in heavy bold quotes, with their new family, in heavy bold quotes. So, I mean, to the extent that local government addresses issues having to do with blight, however one wants to define that,
yes, sir.
They do well to go ahead and
give attention
it's a
to
good
to all
preventive measure.
areas.
A good preventive measure. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir. It's one of those you got to understand. They'll move in where you're going to give them the less attention. And don't think it's just that either. Respectfully, there was a political leader, very well-to-do, just enjoyed politics, but wealthy by other ways. But regardless, we had to go after their child because of gang involvement. So it's not always just the poor areas, but these are areas that need to constantly be given attention also. You can't give more attention to one than the other. And to me, I push the issue to every law enforcement agency is no one should know or your gangs better than you. I should not be able to go into DeKalb County and tell them what they have. They should be able to tell me what they have.
Let me ask you a quick question, and just get too deep into it, but where you have an abandoned structure, whether it's a home, a business, whatever it may be, an abandoned strip shopping center.
Yes, sir.
To your knowledge, right now, I mean, even if the county or the state, whoever it is, has not condemned the building and taken it within a legal taking, do they have the ability to at least board it up and make it non-accessible, so that at the very least, even if they haven't formally taken the property through their exercise of eminent domain on a truly blighted property, and that is a separate debate, but if they haven't formally taken it, do they at least have the ability, either through health ordinances or public safety ordinances, whether they be state or local, to at least board it up so that, if they have a knowledge of gang activity in that local area, so they can at least prevent it from being used?
Yes, sir. Some years back, I got the lent out, so to speak, to a group that was called Operation Fixing Broken Windows.
Mm-hmm.
And our objective for 6 months was to deal with such things like that, about the tagging of the signs, of the street, of the empty houses, of the maintaining of homes. And it was an eye-opener for me. I thought I was pretty knowledgeable with gangs, but I was surprised what other tools were available by what you have in local code enforcements and just local laws that you never thought of that you can use to combat a lot of these problems. And many of us do have that available to us. We just need to, again, speak with one another. Because I'm a Gwinnett County police officer doesn't mean I'm not going to speak to my city officers, nor should I ignore my sheriff's department or corrections. I need to share information with my state prison in Beaufort, and I should also not leave out school resource or the code enforcement officers. People think, well, you don't speak to your probation and juvenile courts. All of that is part of it. And what each one of you have to offer, you'd be surprised what you can do for your jurisdiction on that. To me, that is a big necessity. You need to make those places not accessible. And that gives also, as a working many years as a patrol officer, and still do get in my uniform and patrol sometimes at 2, 3 in the morning to look for these gang members. I discover areas like that, with that being boarded like that and I can check it, it makes me more comfortable knowing there's nothing going on inside.
Mr. Everson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question. I just want to personally thank you for what you do for Gwinnett County and the state of Georgia. I know the gang unit there in Gwinnett County has assisted my chief, Roy Whitehead, in Snellville. Yes, we had a similar incident down there, and we were able to get in front of it, nip it in the bud, and you're exactly right. The sooner you pay attention to this, the tagging and the signs, and address it immediately, the better off we all are going to be. And I just want to thank you for your service in law enforcement, in addition to your service military-wise. Thank you so much for what you do.
Mr. Silva, thank you so much for your appearance this morning. We really appreciate it and your service.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me ask Michael Caldwell with the Georgia General Counsel for the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police. Oh, okay. Okay. Fair enough. Let me, we have some time, so let me, Sandy Michaels has been patient with the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. If you want to come forward, Ms. Michaels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank District Attorney Keith Fleming and Mike Carlson for contacting me and asking me for
If you could speak into the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
On this bill. I appreciate their willingness to work. And Gwen's right. We do have just a few...
I need you to choose a microphone. You can have both.
This one, sorry.
It's all right.
I thought it was loud. We just have a few language areas, but I'd like to cut to the main issues we have that I think are more substantive than just language issues.
Sure, and let me just for purposes of planning, and it really was a time factor in being respectful of people's time on a Friday morning on a recess day. I would absolutely invite you, if there are issues that you want to identify now, we can do that. I think in terms of going over the bill on a section-by-section basis, candidly, it's not that complex. That being said, that'll get us over into the lunch hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, including folks in the audience. It would be helpful if you do have specific concerns in the bill to go and point those out. That will help us when we do the section-by-section next week to maybe do that in a little more efficient manner, and hopefully we can wrap it up at some point next week.
What I'd like to do is I plan to just send a memo on all the language to all
That'd be
committee
great.
members like we usually do.
Sure.
But I was going to go to the specific sections, and I'm going to go backwards. Last page, page 9, section 13. Gwen was correct. I'm sorry?
Say again where you were.
All right. How about just the last page, section 13?
There was.
I have. I have 4011, which is the most recent one I've been provided.
What we that's right. It's 4030
that
ER.
one. Sure.
Yeah.
It's already been alluded to, Section 13, where they have the, our concern is you get 10 to serve 2, and our concern is keeping someone.
This is the probation supervision section you're talking about.
Okay.
Section 10 of the
Yeah,
substitute.
I'm so sorry.
Excuse me, of the bill that members have.
All right, page 7, Section 10. Our concern was creating the period of supervision shall remain in effect until the termination of the sentence. Those are lines 206, 207. I think creating that as a mandate that, again, the example I have is serve, you get 10 to serve 2, the remaining 8, you would be required to serve the 8 forever on probation until the very end. And I just think a more effective and use of our time and finances would be to allow the probation officer to determine if the subject matter has really completed their rehabilitation, and it looks like it. I actually have represented a successful rehabilitated gang member, and he really did kick it. And I'm just thinking, financially, in the financial times we are, I'd just like to have a little more facts on that, of how much that's going to cost.
Well, I mean, I think we'd want to hear from the probation, the applicable folks who would, go ahead and perform the service. I mean, probation is probation. The issue here is whether or not it's going to be supervised, right? Because you're supervised for a couple of years, and then you're out of the supervision.
You can be early terminated, correct.
But the probation is there. The question is, how long is the supervision period, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And when I say early termination, it means from direct supervision.
Right.
The other area, and let me just make sure I'm in the right spot. Page 5, Section 5, lines 136 to 139. That is a huge expansion of the similar transaction rule. Similar transaction rule is one that's continually under criticism. And if I'm misreading this, I apologize, but it appears that means that if you go to trial, it's not just your bad acts that will come in against you. It's like if you have any friends that committed any bad acts against you. And that is a very large expansion of a similar transaction rule in almost sort of a skewed way. And I think that's one thing we would have problems with. And I also think that's one thing, I appreciate, I've worked really hard on these gang bills for the last 15 years here at the Capitol, ever since the first one was started. And I know there were mistakes made and language issues, but I think if you're talking about putting this bill up for a challenge, that would be problematic. The other ones, I think are just very minor issues that I would prefer to just work out with the proponents of the bill. Those are where our two major concerns.
Since you're up there, I wanted to just ask you about. I actually had a question, and just looking at it, another time. This is on page 2, line 41, and this is in the legislative findings. And as we saw in the Rodriguez case, the Supreme Court, I think, expressed its appreciation in its own way for us giving them a roadmap of what it is we're trying to get done and what our intent was and is. I don't see, in line 42, it is necessary to ensure that evidence of criminal gang activity and criminal street gangs shall be admissible in trials and proceedings under this chapter. When I have looked at that a few times, I was a little worried about a blanket admissibility, but as I look at it more, my assumption is, and I would want to get your perspective on it, my assumption is that, of course, the admissibility of X is still going to be subject to the potential for a challenge in a hearing in case the defense would want to challenge the admissibility of it. And my sense of it is that the language there in Section E doesn't prevent the defense from coming forward and challenging the admissibility, and I would welcome your comments on that.
I believe that's accurate. I mean, there's always issues about, how broad was the color, the association language, and obviously the court's spoken on that. But I do think the concerns I just raised on the similar transaction part, and I'm using that phrase similar transaction, but what this bill calls for is a new phrase. It's not necessarily
right. A similar transaction
of
is
a friend.
Is a transaction of the individual themselves. This is from what, and I'm not trying to put words on your mouth. It's the commission of an offense by an associate. And we'll give the DAs the appropriate time. We'll see if we have time, the ability to respond to that. But let me, Ms. Benfield.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize for being late. I had an event in my district that I could not change. And I apologize if this has already been covered, but can we get a copy of the Rodriguez case? Maybe Mary Lou could just email that to the members. I'd like to review that. And second, with regard to the similar transaction evidence, that does concern me as well. And so I want to know from Ms. Michaels, are there other sections in the Georgia Code, or the Prosecuting Attorneys Council may know this, where similar transactions of associates are allowed into evidence, or even similar transactions of a co-defendant?
Not in a criminal matter that I'm aware of, but I don't do civil law, so I couldn't answer that.
Ms. Benfield, what we can do is we can have Mr. Floyd, who is nodding his head. What I'd like to do is go through a round with Ms. Michaels, and then to the extent that there's the time and energy for Mr. Floyd to respond, so we can wrap that up and we can get his perspective as well in a responsive manner.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead. Sure. Mr. Sessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a question I wanted to address directly to your concerns on Section 5. And I'm reading the change of or associate differently than you are. I mean, isn't it true that the section that we're dealing with in the RICO statute here already allows, using the concept of similar transactions, it's already contemplated, is it not, that a member of a gang that performs an act that other members of the gang have performed are relevant to each other in a prosecution. So that if a member of a gang performs an act, other members of the gang have performed similar acts, then because of the way the RICO statute is comprised, that is a similar transaction, because you see this pattern of activity by members, another member that follows the same pattern of activity. I mean, it's the current statute allows that to happen for members, does it not today?
I don't believe so, because the difference between Section 5 and what you just described, I think what you're describing is the pattern activity of a gang would be able to come in, but this would be a specific bad act of another person would be used to show that you were therefore more likely to have committed a bad act because you had a friend that committed a bad act. This opens a whole new
this
law.
No, I think, and we'll flesh this out, believe me. As I'm looking at it, really the intent behind it, and the intent is not necessarily sometimes what's written, and I'm the first one to say so. The commission of an offense, the underlying act, these are all the underlying predicate acts that have got to occur. Mr. Franklin referred to an armed robbery, and I will too, by any member or associate of a criminal street gang. Where I think where we're getting to on that is that you can have this underlying act and not be an official member of the act. I mean, excuse me, of the gang. You can be an associate of the gang and be part of that ongoing criminal enterprise, while not being an official member according to their, initiation rights or whatever. That's the sense I have of it. That's up for debate as everything else is, but I wanted to just make sure that Ms. Michaels knew where I was coming from on it and how I'm reading it, and defer back to you, Mr. Sessler.
That's exactly how I'm reading it, Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
that the extent to which similar actions that are patterns of criminal activity within a gang isn't changed from current law in this language specifically. That may be addressed at some other point, but all this does, in my reading of it, is it takes, to the extent to which that's already the case for members, it expands it to associates, which is someone that might not meet the strictest definition of member, i.e. they're wearing the tattoos or they've been beaten into the gang, the, quote, membership rights. But if someone is an associate and they're operating in kind of an affiliated role in which they're acting as members would act, it just expands it to these people. It doesn't change in any way, in my mind, the way a similar transaction by the gang would be handled. I don't see how you're reading that here.
I guess your description of it and the chairman's description makes it. What is an associate? I mean, it's a friend. I mean, there's no description. There's no definition of an associate. I can see, or I can foresee an occasion. If they're the way you just described it, I would have said that was a member of the gang. And the member of the gang, you know, not somebody that just went to what you're just. I mean, I guess the fact that we're having so much confusion gives me pause for concern with this section.
Ms. Michaels, I'd also remind you that it's going to, and just I wanted to check my summaries and look at the language itself. It's going for the purpose of for proving the existence of the gang and the gang activity. I don't think it's going to the specific act of of any particular individual. I see Mr. Carlson nodding. That gives me great comfort.
I will let Mr. Carlson then.
Okay.
You know, I guess
but I think that's very key language.
We read it, and again, we can always be corrected.
And and that goes for me too. But I would point to that going to the proving of the existence of the criminal street gang and the criminal gang activity. I think that's an important distinction. But we'll flesh it out. Mr. Ramsey.
Mr. Chairman, I had very similar questions. It all went to Section 5, so I'll waive.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Franklin. Oh, no, Mr. Michaels. Mr. Franklin's not done with you yet.
Gotta go.
Gee, thanks. I appreciate that.
Sorry, I wasn't looking over there. I apologize.
I'd ask the prosecutor about the distinction between the underlying offense, say the armed robbery, and then the added offense for being in the gang. And I don't know if you were following my questions, or if you could give your opinion on that, and maybe if you've got a different take and a different response than I got from the prosecuting side.
I think I agreed with the prosecutor's side.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Michaels, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Yes, ma'am. We've got some time, so people have come down here, and I want to honor their request to be heard. Mr. Danny Jordan, DeKalb PD. Officer Jordan, I apologize. Sergeant Jordan.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Thank you for being here.
Yes, sir. Thanks. As I said, my name is Sergeant Jordan. I'm with DeKalb County Police. I'm one of the supervisors over the gang unit in DeKalb. And my main comment, I just want to say, obviously we have excellent prosecutor, excellent district attorney, and we got some excellent detectives doing work in DeKalb. And it's been pretty successful. I just want to say, this may just be a small change with the language, but I think it'll be very effective with the officers on the street. And that's basically the comment I wanted to give everybody.
Well, that matters. I mean, a lot of times here, we vote on words on paper, and sometimes we don't have a clear picture as to how effective it would be in terms of implementation, whether it's someone in your capacity. Right. Whether it's an investigator like Mr. Silva, whether it's a district attorney like Ms. Keys Fleming and her team. So, I mean, that's good to hear, because that gives us comfort that what we're doing, what we propose to do anyway, right, is we'll have a material effect, and exactly. That material effect is important, especially when you consider the PowerPoint presentation we saw in the education we got this morning, which was I described it as an eye-opener, and speaking for myself, it was an eye-opener. So, right. Sergeant, we appreciate your service and your commitment to the community.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. Any questions for Sergeant Jordan? Seeing none. Thank you, sir.
Just try and keep Chief O'Brien in line out there, okay?
Mr. Floyd, I'd like to recognize you, and if you have any specific comments that you'd like to make, you'll be our final witness. We've got a few minutes. If anything in particular that you wanted to talk about as a follow-up to any of the testimony that you've heard here, I know your commitment on this issue, both in the context of the Rodriguez case, or if you have anything responsive to Ms. Michaels' comments, that's fine too. I'll just leave it open for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can cover a little something on each category, and I know the time, so I'll be brief. At least one of your colleagues knows my propensity to hold forth on this subject, so I'll try to break the mold. But
yeah, you're right before lunch, you know.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant. This takes place in a context that Ms. Keys Fleming alluded to at the beginning, and she referenced the RICO statute. Federal statute was enacted in 1970. There weren't any significant prosecutions for about 10 years. The fellow who wrote the statute, Professor Blakey at Notre Dame's a good friend and colleague of mine. As he explained, it took 10 years to train the agents and train the prosecutors to use that statute. It's been enormously successful. I mean, it's broadly acknowledged as the single most useful tool this country has ever had against organized crime. This gang statute is a modernized, more specific version of that statute. It's specifically targeted. In some respects, we could maybe use RICO on this, but the Gang Act is tailored to this specific problem. Frankly, the reason I spend the time that I do with the DeKalb DA's office is it's a fine office. It has fine people. I first worked with them when Mr. Morgan was the district attorney, and I've continued to do so since. This is important to me because I realize how big a problem this is, and it is worth it to me to devote my time to it. And they've been kind enough to let me hang around with them a little bit and occasionally contribute. I was thinking as I listened to the testimony about how I could best explain the effect of RICO and then how you could best apply that to the specific statute in front of you and what we've got. This is a quote. Under RICO, no matter who we are, if we're together, they'll get every one of us. That was picked up on an FBI wire in about 1985. The guy speaking was Gennaro Angiulo. He was the head of the Boston mob. He was right. They got him. They got every one of his 5 brothers as well. And largely the Boston mob is gone today. And the mob has retreated around the country. Why? It's because the statute allowed prosecutors to tell the whole story. And it's important when you're considering the arguments about similar transactions as it's been characterized. This isn't really a modification of similar transaction laws. I'll explain in just a second. But what did the statute do? Well, we're talking really about organizations. I mean, most of the questions, and this is entirely normal, are about individual gang members and individual events. But here's what a gang does analytically. They commit intra-gang crimes amongst themselves. Often the first crime that's committed is by gang members against an aspiring gang member or a new gang member. The men are beaten, the boys are beaten, the girls have sex. There's a brutal internal discipline process, and one of the common phrases is blood in, blood out. You bleed when you come in, you bleed or you die when you leave. These guys don't have 401k plans. If you look at the Department of Corrections interviews with Mara Salvatrucha members, they ask, how do you leave? How do you leave the gang? It's a very simple one-word answer, death. That's the answer the corrections officials get. That's the level of commitment once it begins in the higher level international sophisticated gangs. Congress went back and looked at RICO about 30 years after it was enacted, and they said, what have we got here? You know, what have we accomplished, if anything? It's a little bit of a long quote, but I'll read it because it's important. Before the act, the government's efforts were necessarily piecemeal, attacking isolated segments of the organization as they engaged in single criminal acts. The leaders, when caught, were only penalized for what seemed to be unimportant crimes. The larger meaning of these crimes was lost because the big picture could not be presented in a single criminal prosecution. With the passage of RICO, the entire picture of the organization's criminal behavior and the involvement of its leaders in directing that behavior could be captured and presented. That's exactly what this statute does. I mean, the most important thing about it is not the sentencing, although that's very important, or the probation supervision, or the other components to it. The most important thing is it lets a prosecutor tell the story about why that crime happened. So in an intra-gang situation, it's the brutal initiation ritual or the internal discipline. Somebody who fails in one gang to immediately respond to an insult from another gang member is themselves beaten. They may even be killed. Inter-gang violence, what we mostly think of, the drive-by shootings, the conflicts, certainly that happens. That can involve a homicide, that can involve an aggravated battery, etc. And then you have what we call extra-gang activities, and that involves the interaction between a gang and a civilian, a non-gang member. That's the entirely innocent person who has a bullet come through a window and kill them. It's the person who's waiting at a bus stop when a gang exchange of gunfire happens. It's also the people who get robbed by gang members who want money. It's the people who have drugs peddled in their neighborhoods and sold to them who may die from the use of those drugs. And it's the person who has the character, it's the child who has the character to say, I'm not going to join this gang, who's beaten for it. All of those people are extra gang victims. So you've got three categories of principally violent behavior that happen. They're all interwoven, and they all hinge, ultimately, the fulcrum for all of them is the gang. And if the prosecutors can't explain that, they can't tell the jury the truth. I mean, the simple fact is this is decided to lift what had become an artificial veil in the law that kept jurors from understanding what was really happening, kept judges from understanding what was really happening when they were sentencing. And the critical thing here, and I think it's something to keep in perspective as you analyze, the concerns and arguments about this, the word that the findings of fact that the General Assembly codified here, that they use with regard with gangs, that you and your colleagues used, is the word eradication. I mean, the purpose of this statute and this effort, all of these law enforcement officers and prosecutors, all of these experts, all these people who devoted their time to it, it's not just to catch a group of relatively young, misguided, violent people who will be instantly replaced by others like themselves, or even more. To put one away and have two take their place will not accomplish what anybody in this room wants to see happen. Ultimately, you have to eradicate the gangs. I mean, themselves. You're targeting the organization. You have to learn about the organization, you have to study it, and you have to be able to tell the jury about it. Because the organization is why this is all happening. The organization continues after any individual gang member goes to prison, if they leave, if they're rehabilitated, if they're immobilized by an injury that suffers. They're in a wheelchair because they got shot. Whatever that happens, it goes beyond that one person. And so these organizations are dynamic. They're constantly growing. They're constantly replacing lost personnel and recruiting new personnel. To not be able to talk about the organization is simply to hamstring the entire effort. In the situation of traditional organized crime, the mafia, Cosa Nostra, that's what happened. Some of you may remember hearings going back to the 70s with guys sitting there with, they came in and they actually wore dark glasses as they testified in front of Congress. And the only thing they did was grow roses or whatever it was. Well, no, they were lifelong criminals. That was their business. That was their profession. And they got a little bit of a kick of sitting there looking at whatever chairman it was, if it was Bobby Kennedy at the time or whoever it was, and saying, no, I have no idea. There is no mafia. With RICO, you had a situation where federal prosecutors came in. They had the tapes of the initiation ceremonies. Nobody could deny it anymore. And they were able to flip the members who came in and explained to the juries how it worked. The word associate is not a synonym for friend here. I mean, association is an affirmative, knowing act. It's a choice to join and affiliate yourself with one of these things. You don't become a gang member because you have a friend who becomes a gang member. That's not what this statute's talking about. This statute is talking about people who choose to have a bond, to have a relationship with a gang, which is often part of a spectrum of an increasing ladder of involvement, ending with full-fledged membership or even leadership. You're not sitting here saying, gee, who does he sit next to, or who gave him a ride home, or something like that. A benign purpose is not a criminal purpose. There's no intent involved in it. But association is important. I mean, in the mob, to be an associate is a status. It's a job description. It is also a verb in this context that describes something that's relevant to proving this, proving the existence of these gangs. A gang is nothing but people who have chosen to associate. They don't incorporate. They don't form LLPs and LLCs. That's what they do, that's what they are, and that's why that evidence is relevant.
Questions?
I'm aware of the hour, and I made a promise. If there's a question,
You've done
I'll
well.
answer it.
You've done well. Questions from Mr. Floyd. Ms. Benfield.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Do you have a good definition of associate?
In this circumstance, an associate in context, I mean, when a term is not defined in the statute, the way the courts analyze, as you well know, is they look to the ordinary meaning in the context of the statute. Here, the word associate is used in relation to gangs and gang members. It's not, it doesn't, the comparative term used was friend before, and as you can tell, I respectfully disagree with that. I think that's overbroad. It may be a concern, but I don't think it's a concern that's actually supported by the text. As I said here, I think associate really requires an affirmative act. I can't make you associate with me. You have to choose to be associated with me. I think that's the critical distinction. And if the concern is that that the statute would sweep up people who simply are in mere proximity or are acquainted with a person, I don't think that's supported by the language, and I don't think it's supported by the text or the statement of intent at the beginning of the statute. Association in that context could be constitutionally protected, and the General Assembly has made its position very clear that this statute is not to intrude upon constitutionally protected rights. So if some judge were to read it to go that far, it's going to collide with the Constitution, and we know which one wins.
So would you advise trying to put in a definition that would clarify that it takes some specific act as opposed to merely I know friend is not appropriate, but just to make sure it's not overly interpreted because unfortunately we have no legislative intent in Georgia. So I don't.
I mean, I understand the concern, and I'm respectful of it. I don't think it's necessary, and the reason is, although generally we don't have legislative intent because we don't have the same sort of record keeping Congress does, the General Assembly does occasionally in enacting a bill express a specific intent with regard to a bill. It has done here. It has done in RICO. The word associate is a word in Georgia RICO. It is not defined there, and there's been no problem with that. The statute's been challenged as being vague, and every challenge has been rejected.
Okay.
Federal RICO uses the word associate. It's been challenged there. Every challenge has been rejected. I mean, every challenge, we've had RICO statutes in this country for 40 years now. There are 35 state and territorial statutes. None of them has ever been successfully challenged on an overbreadth basis, and virtually every one uses the word associate.
Does federal law define it?
No, it does not.
Okay.
No, it's given its ordinary meaning in the context of the statute.
Thank you.
Mr. Sessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just preface this by saying I do support a strong RICO statute in the state. I mean, I think the way you got to demonstrate this infrastructure of crime is really the it that we're getting after when you're pursuing some of these criminal organizations. That said, I do want to be conscious, and I don't really. This is a genuine question. This isn't a leading or rhetorical question. I really want to know the answer to this, particularly perhaps in Georgia code. Perhaps you can speak to it on the federal side as well. What changes would have to be made, or what logical leaps specifically would have to be made for some point in the future, be it 2025, 2050, 2080, for the behavior of a religious group, a sectarian group, a group that's seen as a, quote, having extremist beliefs to be kind of fall under this RICO framework, perhaps by an activist government entity. I mean, we talk about terrorism,
right?
And if it's almost if with some of the concerns I've had in the last 10 years, watching things at the federal level evolve and different theories of who's a terrorist, who's not a terrorist, what extreme belief systems lead to violence, which others might be friendly to violence philosophically, but don't pursue any violent ends themselves. Right. What steps specifically would have to be made in Georgia law, then perhaps very briefly federal law, but more specifically Georgia law, would have to be made for a religious group or a group of people that had a set of beliefs that weren't savory and appreciated by the general public to be defined under this RICO framework?
Well, that's not a new concern. It has come up under federal RICO in the past. There were cases involving abortion protesting, particularly in the 80s. The outcome of the case law was basically to say to be opposed to abortion if it's legal in a particular state is simply a belief. It's an opinion. That's not punishable. That's not criminal. If someone engages in criminal conduct as a result, the example would be murder a doctor, set off a bomb. That would be criminal. If you did it in association with other people as part of an enterprise, and that was its objective, it could be a conspiracy. But it's important to realize, and this is something that the court looked at in Rodriguez, and what the Georgia Supreme Court did in this context, it's not radical. I mean, Rodriguez is entirely consistent with literally dozens of state and federal decisions across the United States. And I think probably every legislature has to confront these concerns and make sure that somehow, in the hopes of addressing something that everybody agrees is pernicious, you haven't inadvertently backed into attacking some group that may not be popular but is not criminal in any meaningful sense. This statute punishes conduct. It doesn't punish beliefs. I mean, nobody is guilty because they wear a certain baseball cap a certain way. That could prove their association with a gang. It might be relevant to the existence of a gang, but that's not a crime. And nobody, as Rodriguez points out, nobody is subject to the 10-year sentence or the other enhanced aspects of this statute unless they commit a crime. They've got to have criminal intent. And then the question is the context in which that happens, and is the Gang Act involved? This doesn't pick up somebody because of whom they worship, or even because they express a view that might be offensive, or even that they express a view that implicates violence. They have to act. They have to do something before this statute starts to attach. I don't know if that completely addresses your question, but
well, I guess to me, I'll use the example you brought up. You brought up a Right to Life organization, for example. Could be a civil rights organization that uses civil disobedience as a means of as a tactic. Again, civil disobedience, almost by definition, is breaking some law. I mean, it could be refusing to get out of the street. It could be any number of things. But whether it's a Right to Life group that's refuses to get off a sidewalk, or a civil rights group that refuses to through nonviolent means, let's say, for example, but the organization itself really preaches and speaks to the concept of using nonviolent but yet still civil disobedience, by definition breaking the law, as a means of accomplishing an end.
Right.
Let's maybe take a civil rights organization, perhaps, 40 years ago or today.
Mm-hmm.
What would be required under this framework for a civil rights group that perhaps didn't preach violent crime but yet still breaking the law, but it is a core value and an organizational focus for the organization to be able to be prosecuted under RICO with some pretty stiff penalties?
Yeah, I don't think it would be able to be prosecuted under RICO, and I'm not aware.
What step would have to be taken to do that?
What's the additional step?
Yes.
I don't think there is a constitutional additional step. That's sort of my problem, because at the end of the day, if you're just talking about if you're talking about beliefs, not action, you're not violating a statute.
But if the organization was using civil disobedience as the means to do that, which by definition is breaking some laws, not laws that tend to offend the conscience.
But those, I'm sorry, those civil disobedience, those particular acts are not the, if I understand correctly, are not the underlying requisite predicate acts that could bring a RICO prosecution. Is that a correct statement?
That's
the
true.
predicate act has to be the armed robbery that Mr. Franklin talked about before.
So if it's not enumerated among those 40 or so acts in RICO, then it's by definition off the table.
And in neither the RICO statute nor the gang statute are all crimes predicate acts under this. It's a defined term. There is a list, and the General Assembly has chosen what they are. For example, simple trespass, which is a classic, I think, example of civil disobedience. I mean, people use civil disobedience in a lot of different terms. It has a lot of meaning attached to it. I think of it as somebody making a moral statement because they say, I am willing to suffer some degree of punishment to draw attention to a cause.
Right.
So I may sit somewhere, or I may refuse to move from somewhere, and a law enforcement officer instructs me I must, and I say, I'm sorry, respectfully, I'm not going to do that. And I'm taken into custody. I'm making a point there, and I'm hoping to draw attention to it. And that's a choice people can make, and certainly they have. that kind of conduct isn't encompassed within either statute.
And it's state, I mean, in our state RICO statute, I mean, there are 30-something predicate acts that can be used to establish the pattern of conduct in which RICO would kick in. That said, and just to make sure I'm not misleading anyone, they're not just violent crimes. I mean, insurance fraud is one. You know, they're not just, you know, violent crimes. There's white-collar aspects to it as well, and that's a lot of times, well, I say a lot, but my understanding is that it's a very prevalent, those predicate acts are used fairly often in the prosecution of some of the larger criminal syndicates where they can't use the violent crimes because they don't have the evidence of it, but they do have it on paper. It goes back to the Capone tax evasion, you know, nexus there, and that was the natural outgrowth in using those white-collar predicate acts as the hook for RICO, and that's what brings the hammer.
So the way we manage that as a General Assembly is by managing that list of predicate acts, then by definition and with certainty, anything other than those is excluded as being RICO-based.
That is correct.
That's right.
Yes,
Okay.
It's not a dragnet statute. It's not all-encompassing. There actually are a couple of examples, Virgin Islands, I think, that have actually done that. Every felony is a predicate act. Georgia chose not to do that and has been very careful in both the RICO statute and in the Gang Act statute to say it is not the intent of the General Assembly to impair free speech as such or to restrict other constitutional rights. So if the concern is the presence of a safeguard, those two things, definitional and constitutional, are the principal safeguards. I'm not aware of any religious group that I think anybody in here would think of as a legitimate one that did not engage in some overtly criminal activity, violence, theft, extortion, that has ever been subject to any form of RICO.
And it has to be enunciated again on that list of 30-something, you know, crimes that would form the basis of a predicate act. The key word, I think, Mr. Floyd said, is managing. It's making sure, because the opportunity for abuse of RICO is there. It's absolutely positively there in the absence of management of that list. And it's where, you know, some folks in their zeal for safe streets, and we all appreciate that, you know, maybe can potentially in the future overstep on that. But if we're responsible in our management of that list of predicate acts, we won't have that problem. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time. This was time well spent. We'll go ahead and we'll schedule the bill again as soon as possible next week for action. Thank you again.